Durud and welcome to our latest edition of the Iranian Studies Initiative lectures in collaboration with the University of California, Santa Barbara. I am Alireza Ardekani, the Executive Director of Farhang Foundation, a non-political, non-religious, and not-for-profit organization that thrives with the support of its members. Our sole mission is to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture for the benefit of the global community at large. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Fatemeh Shams from the University of Pennsylvania for the Worldliness of Sohrab Sepekhri's Poetics. This series is made possible with the support of the American Institute of Iranian Studies, the Persian Heritage Foundation, the California Humanities, and the Geramian Imrani Foundation. Please note that we will be holding a Q&A session at the end of today's program, so please do submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Shiva Balaghi, cultural historian and academic coordinator of the Area of Global Initiative at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Hello, thank you so much, Alireza, for the kind introduction. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Fatemeh Shams, who is a literary social historian and poet who currently serves as Associate Professor of Persian Literature at the University of Pennsylvania. She's extensively published on the relationship between literature, power, and political ideology. Her critical monograph, A Revolution in Rhyme, Poetic Co-option Under the Islamic Republic, which was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press, is the first comprehensive study of state-sponsored poetic production and institutionalization of literature after the 1979 revolution. Shams is also an internationally acclaimed award-winning poet with 3 poetry collections. Her poems have been featured in numerous publications. This lecture and others in the series that is co-organized by the UCSB Iranian Studies Initiative and Farhang Foundation will be live streamed and available via social media such as YouTube and Facebook. I hope you join us for the remainder of the series, which will continue through May 2024. Without further ado, I introduce to you Dr. Fatemeh Shams.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you very much to the Farhang Foundation, Professor Janed Afari, Alireza Aziz, and Dr. Balaghi for hosting this lecture. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share with those of you who made the time to be here my thoughts on the poetry of Sohrab Sepehri. I would like to start with briefly with a note to say that in the 40 minutes that I have, it will be almost impossible, if not impossible, to cover the rich oeuvre of Sepehri's poetics and his artistic output. So I apologize in advance if sometimes I have to go a little bit faster, and also if I don't cover everything. I'm hoping that we will have enough time during the Q&A for those of you who have questions to ask, any questions that I have not possibly covered during this talk. I'm going to set my time so that I won't go over time. Okay, so as you can see, the title of my talk is The Worldliness of Sohrab Sepekhri's Poetics. And in what follows, I try to do fulfill two tasks. One, try to explain the relationship of Sepehri with the so-called modernist movement, and also ways in which he himself modernized the modern Persian poetry, or the new poetic movement that emerged in the late 19th century, but really peaked in the early 20th century and onward. A quick note for probably a lot of you already know that along with Nima Yushish, Forough Farrokhzad, Ahmad Shamlu, and Mehdi Akhavan Sales, Sepehri is one of the 5 major modernist poets of contemporary Iran. He rose to prominence during the 1960s and was one of the best-selling poets of Iran when he passed away relatively early at the age of 51 in year 1980. His fame mostly remained posthumous, although, as I mentioned, he was one of the widely recognized modernist poets and artists of his time. I wanted to mention at the beginning that what distinguishes him in his artistic expression and output from his fellow poets, meaning the poets that are, here and also other poets of his time, is the fact that he was first and foremost a painter. So that's a very important dimension of his poetic and artistic character that I will briefly also get back to later. So his poetry was constantly and deeply informed by his painting. Also, he infused poetry with both Western and Eastern, meaning Eastern Asian modernist elements and frameworks. And his unique recasting of Eastern religions and spirituality remains from Taoism to Buddhism to Islamic mysticism, also remains one of his, sort of distinct characters. Another important point that I would like to mention with regards to Sepehri's poetics, and this is something that I'm going to elaborate upon during this talk and will be the focus of this talk, is that he gave birth to a new form of multiculturalism by his unique approach to the use of space and image in modern Persian poetry. That's something that I will focus later in my talk. Another point that I would not talk about later, but I think it's important to mention about Sepehri, is that his reception. He's one of the poets that during his lifetime and also after his death was the subject of a lot of criticism and reflection by other poets, critics, but also just general public. Gholam Hossein Yousefi, the literary scholar and critic, has in his book Cheshme Roshan has a line that I think really encapsulates the sort of the complicated and polarized reception of Sohrab Sepehri. He says that, like so many other things discussing Sepehri in our society has fallen into extremes. Some believe that if he wrote his poetry in other living major languages of the world, he would have been recognized as one of the major world poets. And also, others called him a sentimentalist, a fantastical poet who was detached from the reality of his time, and he was not really committed to or concerned about social and political upheavals of his time. So these two groups of critics usually, read Sepehri in their own, kind of selective reading and understanding of Sepehri. Most of these readings, not all of them, but most of these readings have been either in isolation or in relation to only a limited domain of Sepehri's work or a dimension of Sepehri's work, either in relation to form or in relation to his predecessors like Nima Yushij and other poets of his time, or only focusing on his, sort of take on Persian mysticism, Indian Buddhism, or Taoism, or Japanese Zen. And this has been mostly the obsession among the critics when they talk about, Sepehri's contribution. I'm not saying these are wrong, but what I'm saying is that they're not enough to understand Sepehri's tribalizing role in revolutionizing Persian poetry. I believe that in order to have a better and more thorough understanding of Sepehri, it's important that we read his work in the transnational context of modernism of the 20th century. So one thing that, I think it's important also to keep in mind is that the meaning what I'm trying to do here is to show how Sepehri contributed in the process of meaning making in Persian poetry by creating new alternate spaces that previously weren't as sort of present and visible in the Persian poetic scene, and also through this use of space, he is basically expanding the notion of selfhood. So we are in Sepehri's poetry, probably a lot of you have experienced, we have a kind of selfhood that is incredibly hybrid and also fluid, and an identity that really goes beyond the rigid ideologies of his time. So since I'm mentioning modernism a lot, I thought it's important to kind of very briefly touch upon, the modernist movement, particularly as it relates to art and poetry. So modernism was basically the emergence of, the critics define it as the emergence of a broad transnational cultural movement originating in the late 19th century, and then peaking in the wake of the World War I and later on in its aftermath. Different, we have, as you can see in these, paintings, we have different trends also that, emerge later on, such as Surrealism, that are important in our discussion and understanding of Sepehri. But what is important to keep in mind about modernism is that the modernist artists and poets and writers in general, they're trying to find new ways in order to articulate the ineffable experiences that became very crucial for the human being, really, for the people, for the individuals in the aftermath of the World War I, to find a new language and a new approach in order to, deal with the realities of war, which was a reality that was deeply fragmented, quite uncanny, and in order to understand and articulate that, artists have to find a new means and new methods. That's that's a very general definition. A few publications were very important and inspiring to the modernist writers and artists. The publication of Freud's interpretation of dreams, Fraser's Golden Bough, Nietzsche's writings, and these were important writings that, along with the major technological change and also the growth of urban cities, as well as migration, all of them played an important role in basically a revolt against that scientific positivism, or the idea that science will save the world, or this rigid understanding and relationship of the human being with reality. So as I mentioned, in an era where fragmentation and also spiritual dissonance were part of the, experience of the human condition, another important factor was basically the fragmentation and also the, the disillusionment that was produced by colonization, and also this idea that ignoring the materiality in order to sort of in favor of the individual, in favor of the ideological idealism, was something that modernists tried to challenge. So as far as the poetry was concerned, there were, of course, other writers such as Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, the late 19th century poets, that played a really important role in the modernist movement. But those poets who became really like self-conscious and skeptical, basically, about the language, and also its claims on coherence, were poets such as Ezra Pound, as you can see here, as well as T.S. Eliot. Some of their works were key in, sort of changing the scene and revolutionizing the scene, a retrospect and a few don'ts, for example. And also the mottos of these poets were really important. One was to make poetry new through recycling and reformulating and recontextualizing the old, and also to make poetry difficult. This is something that in particular we see in the poetry of T.S. Eliot as one of the major pioneering modernist poets of the 20th century, where he basically invites poets and writers to become more, elusive. And allusion becomes an important component of modernist poetry in general. Another important dimension or sort of feature of modernist poetry was to make it international or transnational, to go beyond the borders. I mentioned that migration played an important role. A very good example of that is the Harlem Renaissance movement that emerged as a result of the migration of the American Southerners to Harlem. Langston Hughes, for example, was a very important poet who was also translated into Persian by Ahmad Shamlou. Modern poetry itself, another important figure, in my opinion, is D.H. Lawrence in a text called Poetry is Present. He basically, and this the poetry of present, he defines what new poetry is, and try to basically reevaluate and reformulate the relationship of form with time, and emphasizing on the fact that, as you can see, the first sentence, sorry if you cannot read it, it's a little bit blurry, is that he's really concerned with making his readers to understand that new poetry or modern poetry is instantaneous, like plasm, as you can see, that it's instant, that it's quick, that it's and naked contact is always something that is extremely important. And I think the last line, that it does not want to get anywhere, and it just wants to take place, is something that is helpful for us to sort of decode Sepehri's poetics later. So this is a poetry that is being reformulated, as you can see, and goes beyond geographical borders of English language as well. So going to Sepehri, a few points about Sepehri. Sepehri was born in 1928. So this is a year that is almost a decade after the end of the First World War, and also a time that is concurrent again with a sense of disillusionment around the world, migration, and also fragmentation. It's also roughly 2 decades after the constitutional revolution in Iran, which, as you know, played an extremely important role in revolutionizing Persian poetic form and also language and content. It's a subject matter that is a subject matter of another lecture. I don't get into the constitutional revolution, but I think this timeline is extremely important. Modernist Persian poetry is very much already being discussed and experimented by poets such as Nima Yushij, and this young reclusive painter was first and foremost a painter born in Kashan, really becomes, start becoming curious about poetry as a result of his early influences, his early acquaintances with these two figures, Manouchehr Sheybani, who was also from Kashan, and he was a painter and a poet, had an enormous impact on Sohrab Sepehri's vision and sort of aesthetics and understanding of poetry and painting, and Moshfegh Kashani, whose poetry was, you know, something that Sepehri was very familiar with. And at the beginning, when Sepehri started to write his own poems in classical forms, he would in fact ask Moshfegh Kashani to read his poetry and give him feedback, you know, and sort of correct his rhyme and meter and so forth. Sepehri moves to Tehran as a young adult, and very soon, when he joins the Department of Fine Arts, Faculty of Fine Arts at Tehran University, and in his basically in his autobiography, as you can see on the top of the page, Khurus Jangi, which was an important, or the translation is Fighting Rooster. It was an important association that was founded by Jalil Ziapur in 1950. Joining this association was extremely important, a sort of a turning point in his journey. So he writes in his autobiography that at the time that he went to Tehran, the tension between old and new was very much part of the literary and artistic scene, and it was in this environment that his work basically began to take form. Khurus Jangi became, was basically the platform for a lot of modernist artists and writers, such as Nima Yushish, Bahman Mohasses, Manouchehr Sheybani, Hushang Irani, and so forth. And the vision was fighting against, as they wrote in their sort of statement, fighting against traditionalism and conservatism that was out of touch with the realities of the time. So Sepehri's sort of moment of literary awakening is really happening during such an environment, such a time, and in such an environment. In his autobiography, he writes, "Poetry was no longer a skill or fan for me, but rather an air of strange trance." This is an important sort of description of, his own understanding of his own poetic taste. So this was a time when he also one day strikes a match, and this is something that he writes in his autobiography, and he basically burns all his ghazals and his rhymed poems as a and starts writing new poetry, as he mentions. So to sort of delve into his new poetry and to have a better understanding of what I'm trying to say here and what I'm trying to do, I try to define a very key concept that I keep going back to and refer to, and that concept is liminality. Liminality is a concept that entered the literary scene, and it was sort of adopted by literary critics from anthropology. It was it's a concept that refers to the rites of passage among in the anthropology, and also particularly to the rites of transition. So the word limen itself means a corridor or a tunnel, sort of a pilgrim's road that goes beyond a mere transition to basically become a new set of life. This is the definition of Victor Turner. The use of liminal basically as far as it relates to poetry and art was an attempt to challenge the hierarchies of language, of aesthetics, and to reimagine connections between the individual and the social setting, the individual and the artistic scene, and anthropologically speaking, it's a concept that basically refers to that transition moment where the members of the society are going through a sort of a moment of separation. They step away from the social setting, from the society, sometimes forbidden to have any kind of contact with their social setting, and then get back into it. They go through a period of incorporation. Okay, without getting too technical about this, I just wanted to say what's important also in relation to liminality is the notion of altered self. So when the individuals step out of the social setting, the notion of self is altered. And then when they come back to the social setting is still the same, but the notion of self in them has changed. So this is something that I'm going to refer to in order to understand Sepehri's unique sort of approach to literary modernism that was really deeply entwined with this notion of transition and going from one space to the other, and also he used this in order to transcend, in my view, to transcend boundaries of ideology, and also to create a dialectical identity and an artistic identity that was potentially quite flexible, fluid, and open to different forms of being and selfhood. Sepehri creates this by different notions and dichotomies of thresholds. So he creates these moments of oscillation, for example, as we will see in his poetry later. We see these, thresholds between dreaming and waking, between living and dying, between actual home and imagined home, and also between water and fire, and windows and doors, humans and non-humans. These are the sort of the dichotomies and thresholds that he constantly go and travel between. And by this, by this traveling and journeying, he creates a third space in his poetry that is neither here nor there. And that's something that, basically what liminality theorists refer to as a key concept. The result is a hybrid poetic identity that, almost anyone can find a space and a place to relate to it and associate with it. In this part, I will read for you in case you can read. This is a poem from his very first collection, Death of Color, Margerang, and a line in his autobiography that I think is kind of, can really guide us to have a better understanding of his relationship at this point with the world, is that he is seeing himself in a room. And the concept of room in general is very, very important to Sepehri. It's a metaphor that changes over time. At the beginning is a static place where he's, contemplating, but also conflicting with the idea of death and life. And we can see that he is trying very hard during this period to basically the tension between the new and old that he was talking about becomes very apparent in this room. In the first poem, Rare, the first part, you can read the second part, but I read the first part for you. If I can actually... So he's talking about the notion of, he's talking about being in a room where the night is at a standstill, and the gaze of the night is locked on the window frame of his room. And this night is filled with questions, and and no answer can be found in this situation. So we are already in this quiet, ambiguous, elusive atmosphere. And then in this room, as he later on mentions in the room, in the poem, for a long time, there is a cold corpse that is laying on the floor of his room. And all of the limbs of this corpse are basically, first of all, amputated, and they're completely dissociated from each other. So the idea of fragmentation that I mentioned before, that as an important part, as important sort of feature of modernist, both modernist poetry, but also modernist painting, is something that we see in this early poem. He talks about this body as a sort of description that he gives us is a rotten, poisonous stench that, you know, the smell of it can basically spread to the farthest edges of his imagination. And the whole poem basically, talks about this anguish that he's experiencing. And at some point, he tries to, in search of the answer to the question, he opens the corpse with his nails. So it's quite a graphic, sort of image. And then digging into every vessel and bone, but he doesn't find any answer for his question. At the end of the poem, he goes back to the opening of the poem, the opening lines, and he basically refers to the same, or repeats the same idea of this ambiguity, this confusion, that is, this aura of uncertainty in the poem that becomes a really important part of his early poetics. Why this poem is important? This poem is important because I think it gives us, sort of a clue about what is he trying to, ground and found for us in expressing his sort of signature sense of over there and in betweenness. It's something that is extremely important in his poetry later on. This collection has been unfortunately rendered and dismissed by most of the critics as a mere imitation of Nima Yushij, and for that reason, a lot of critics just don't bother dealing with it. But I think it's, it's really filled with so many poems that for the first time we see a poet dealing with certain, spaces and giving new sort of meanings and dimensions into them, including rooms and windows and mostly static and closed environments. But later on, we see that this kind of transcends to something else. The second poem is a poem called Yad Bud, or Memorial, from his second collection. And I think, again, this poem is important because Sepehri, in the second collection, we can see clearly that he's expanding, this dialectic relationship between here and there, or interior and exterior, into another level, which is the waking and dreaming. This becomes really a core of his work later on in his other collections as well. And I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind also that dream itself as a space is an ultimate liminal space. It's a space to which we transition and then we come back. Sometimes that notion of self gets altered in the dream world. And, the importance of the dream world, of course, and the unconscious was also something that, as I mentioned, Freud's interpretation of dream and psychoanalysis played a really important role in. But also I will add to this surrealism, which is really important. And, we can't really miss here some parallels between Sohrab's poetry in this period and also the major surrealist works of painting that were being or have been already circulated around, including this important work by Salvador Dali that was, this is a work of 1930s, The Persistence of Memory. And if we read this poem closely, we see that the imageries are remarkably and strikingly actually similar to this painting. In this, in Dali's painting, we can see these melting clocks hanging over empty branches. the first immediate notion that comes to mind is the notion of temporality. And this is something that when we read Sepehri's poem also comes to mind. So I read the poem in Persian, parts of it, not the whole thing, and you can follow the translation here. The poem is called Yadbud, or memorial in Persian. سایه دراز لنگر ساعت روی بیابان بی پایان در نوسان بود. می آمد، می رفت، می آمد، می رفت. و من روی شنهای روشن بیابان تصویر خواب کوتاهم را می کشیدم. خوابی که گرمی دوزخ را نوشیده بود و در هوایش زندگیم آب می شد. خوابی که چون پایان یافت من به پایان خود رسیدم. من تصویر خوابم را می کشیدم و چشمانم نوسان لنگر ساعت را در بحد خودش گم کرده بود. چگونه می شد در رگهای بی فضای این تصویر همه گرمی خواب دوشین را ریخت. تصویرم را کشیدم، چیزی گم شده بود. روی خودم خم شدم، حفره‌ای در هستی من دهان گشود. سایه دراز لنگر ساعت روی بیابان بی پایان در نوسان بود و من کنار تصویر زنده خوابم بودم. The poem continues the same kind of, elusive and sort of very obscure, dream-like world that he creates in this whole collection, really. But the most important part that I think is important to keep in mind is that the spaces, the sort of, the dream coming into Persian poetry as a space, modern Persian poetry as a space in which, painting, as you can see, and the notion of temporality plays into sort of the aesthetics of the poem, and the relationship of the self also with reality and with unconscious is something that becomes really important in Sepehri's poem. Another poem from the same collection is a poem where, we are encountering a new liminal space. This is an important space in Persian poetic tradition in general. Sepehri is not the first one talking about garden or bagh, as we say in Persian. Bagh has a very, very rich trajectory in Persian poetry, and we have it in modernist poetry as well, poetry of Farrukhzad. And I think, similarities between Farrukhzad and Sohrab Sepehri has been something that critics have talked about and written about. But what's really important, what Sepehri does, I think, and Farrukh also sort of, taps into this, is to kind of to surmount this divorce or this detachment or this romantic relationship, purely like sort of pastoral relationship with the beauty of the garden. Garden becomes a place for self-discovery. Garden becomes a place for finding new identities, defining new identities. For Sepehri in particular, becomes a place to search of the self, to kind of understanding his own relationship with the tradition. And garden, in my view, is sort of a metaphor for that tradition as well, but also a place of shelter and refuge where you are sort of transitioning to, but then again coming back to the social context. The poem is called Baghi dar Seda. Again, parts of it I will read in Persian. You can follow in translation. I hope you can read it. در باغی رها شده بودم، نوری بیرنگ و سبک بر من می‌وزید. آیا من خود بدین باغ آمده بودم یا باغ اطراف مرا پر کرده بود؟ هوای باغ از من می‌گذشت و شاخ و برگش در وجودم می‌لغزید. آیا این باغ سایه روحی نبود که لحظه‌ای بر مرداب زندگی خم شده بود؟ ناگهان صدایی باغ را در خود جای داد، صدایی که به هیچ شباهت داشت. گویی عطری خودش را در آینه تماشا می کرد. همیشه از روزنه ناپیدا این صدا در تاریکی زندگیم رها شده بود. سرچشمه صدا گم بود. من ناآگاه آمده بودم. خستگی در من نبود. راهی پیموده نشد. آیا پیش از این زندگیم فضای دیگر داشت؟ ناگهان رنگی دمید. پیکری روی علفها افتاده بود، انسانی که شباهت دوری با خود داشت، باغ در ته چشمانش و جاپای صدا همراه تپش‌هایش. And the poem continues. I think what's clear in this poem is that, again, this liminal space, this garden becomes a space where Sepehri tries to kind of search for a new self, a new poetic identity, a new, artistic identity, using the same sort of recycling, as we mentioned earlier, recycling the imagery that already exists in poetry and sort of giving it a new meaning and rebranding and recasting them is something that are very important, I think, in the first two collections that, nobody really take that seriously. Particularly this one is a collection that a lot of critics believe that most of his weakest poems we can find in these collections. There are important clues for us to understand Sepehri in these early works. That's my argument, basically. So moving on to the next two collections, Ruin of the Sun, Avara Aftab, and East of Sorrow, Sharq Andu, 1961, a year where he publishes these two works. And I think, this is a period between his second and third and fourth collection. It's a period where Sepehri starts to travel wide and far and wide. West, East, New York, Europe, in Paris, he spent some time, and also, he travels to Japan in particular, and India. These are the places where this is a picture of him and his roommate, a Japanese roommate in Japan. And in these travels, the traveling itself, first I have to mention, the traveling itself is an extremely important kind of factor for liminal theorists. They consider it as sort of a transitioning again, going stepping out of your place, out of your time. Time is experienced differently, probably for when you travel, you kind of have that feeling of, the notion of time is distorted. And we see that a new life, new concepts, a new vision really burst into his poetry. So if in the first two collections we have bruised rooms, as you saw, for example, in the poem Rare, here we really see those kind of, liminal spaces are reconfigured and also replaced by other spaces that I will discuss in a minute. A few things that are important to keep in mind here is that during this time, Sepehri, as a result of these travelings, and as you can see in his Tokyo memoir that I've quoted on the top of the page, he really understands or comes to this understanding that, nowhere in this world he really feels at home. Although as much as he loved Kashan and going back to Kashan and writing about his home, and, the very last, one of the very last works that he wrote, Otaq Abi, the Blue Room, the whole idea is to go back to his childhood and writing about his childhood home, but he never really felt that he had a place. And I think this, again, shows his deeply cosmopolitan, multicultural identity where, he felt that he could fit in, but only for a very short period of time. Okay, I've run out of time. So we see in these, in these collections, what becomes really important is really the infusion of his own aesthetics, and with the Zen aesthetics and Zen influenced literature, where again we see that the notion of time is extremely important. Buddhism, during his traveling to journeys into India, becomes extremely important. If I want to mention the gist of argument here is that in modernism in general, even if you look at T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Walt Whitman, Allen Ginsberg, all of these modernist poets paid attention and were fascinated by notions of Buddhism and Eastern spirituality. And so that also puts Sepehri into that sort of category of modernist poets. Also, this also connects him to the long lasting Persian mystical tradition. We have a long tradition of shathiyat irfani, or the sort of the ecstatic utterances of the mystics, that becomes also really important in his poetry of this period, and also the Japanese haiku. We can see the influence of that. But as you can see, the poem on the page also changes, which creates more space that we don't see, and a different kind of space that we don't see in his earlier collections. If I don't know how much time do I have, but I would have liked to.
You can go another 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes.
Another 2 minutes. Okay. I just wanted to mention two things about his final collections, and covering Hasht Ketāb. I realize that it's a really ambitious project, but I think it's really important to see his journey in the sound of the water's footfall, and also in the Traveler, two of his most important collections that he publishes in mid-1960s. Religious transgression becomes really important in the poem. Man musalmanam qiblam yek gul surkh ja namazam cheshme. He uses all the natural elements and sort of replaces the rigid religious ideological symbols with natural symbols, but not necessarily not nature in its romantic sense. And I see that as an act of transgression that I think is really important in connecting the aesthetics of the modernist aesthetics of uncertainty, skepticism, into this his connection with the Eastern spirituality. And another important factor to keep in mind about is sort of towards the end of his life, in the Green Expanse, we have poems, as you can see, the poem I have here, a part of his poem Beyond the Sea, or Poshte Daryaha, where he changes, it kind of transforms that bruised room, the road that he has in Traveler, here with a boat. And boat, again, is a very sort of a liminal space where he is moving towards something unknown, moving towards something that he doesn't know. And at the end, he leaves us with this soft notion of, as he calls at the end of his sequence poem Traveler, the soft notion of nothingness, which I think is again a part of his liminal poetics. I will finish by saying one sentence, hopefully, maybe two, and that is about, in my opinion, the success of Sepehri and the popularity of Sepehri in the post-revolutionary period. There was this fascination with Sepehri, become best-selling. A lot of the poets and critics believed that because he was apolitical and because he was not ideological, he was easier and sort of to not get censored like other poets such as Ahmad Shamlu, who was more active. Akhavan Sales or Furugh Farrokhzad's poetry for its sexually charged nature, or like feminine nature also. Yes, I think all of these are important, but that doesn't mean that Sepehri was apolitical. I think his most political act was to revolutionize the poetic imagery and poetic language and content, as well as form. He experienced with form, and I consider that as a deeply political act in literature. And I think part of the reason for that he was highly popular after the revolution was that Iranians could find a shelter, could find a space, a third space in his poetry, where in the face of 8 years of war and mass executions and oppression and censorship, they could still find a space to take shelter in. And I think Sepehri's poetry gave them that space. I stopped there and I apologize that I went over time. And I'm sorry that I tried to make it beautiful and to use his paintings in the background, but seems like that didn't serve me well. I apologize for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shams. I'm going to invite Dr. Balaghi to come back on.
Sorry. Thank you for that beautiful presentation, Fatemeh. We have a lot of questions from the audience after hearing that really rich and layered presentation of Sepehri's modernism and worldliness. One question is related to the one that I had kind of wanted to ask. I was curious to know if you could compare his worldliness to other modernist Iranian poets of the time. And a member of the audience also asks for you to discuss the impact of the 1953 coup on his work. And so that kind of generation of engaged poets.
That's a great question. And I think they're related. So I tried to answer both in sort of as one answer. So each of these modernist poets, even the ones that I didn't mention, by the way, at the beginning, the 5 poets, the major poets, that canon could be also shattered and questioned and criticized. I understand that, and I think every poet who in this period really tried to introduce something new to the sort of the poetics of the time. I think what's really important that I forgot to mention, but the question from the audience actually points that out, and that's very important, is that Sepehri actually enters the literary scene right at the time when 3 years into his first 2 collections, the 1953 coup happens, and then the rise and also height of the so-called literary commitment. And this is a time when she'r shekast, or the so-called poetry of failure, became sort of important as a response of poets like Mehdi Akhavan Saleh, Ahmad Shamlu, to the oppression and to the persecution and execution of the political prisoners. And the question here is that what was Sepehri's relationship with this? And that's something that critics such as Reza Barahani and others mention and question and sort of challenge Sepehri for being apolitical. Did Sepehri really care about this situation, or what was his view of that? It's a question that we can spend a long time discussing. In my view, I think Sepehri's take on politics and his sort of affiliation and relationship with the everyday political associations was very different from other poets. The most similar, I think, to him, other than Nima Yushich, who was more political than him, I would say, was Forough Farrokhzad. The way that they define their relationship with the literary commitment, and the intellectual circles of the time, much more reclusive than Forough, I think, was Sepehri. And in terms of their worldliness, which I think is a very important question, each of these poets, Shamlu in his own way, with connecting and sort of translating was his thing. Like, he was really active in translating Lorca, translating Langston Hughes, and Neruda, and this kind of act of translation as a political act was really important in his connection with sort of the world literature, and also the whole social movements of the global South, which was really important to him. Akhavan Saleh, I would say, less than others, both in terms of form and language, but also in terms of the way they sort of perceived the poetic tradition of the past and present. I think he has, if we want to say which one is the most remote case, would be Akhavan compared to Sepehri, and the closest of all, I think, would be Forough Farrokhzad, in terms of the way they, revolutionized Persian poetry and tried to make it transnational. We can talk about that a lot, but I think
yes, thank you for that. So the next question I'm going to ask you kind of combines several audience questions. One person wants to know if you believe that Sepehri is well known universally, and to talk about the significance of that and how one measures that. And another person wants to know what's a good starting point for reading Sepehri. What would be a good book to begin if one wants to explore his work more?
Very good questions. In terms of his international reception, I'm afraid, compared to other poets, in general, I would say modern Persian poetry is still a stranger to the world. I mean, we do have translations, of course. Forough Farrokhzad, I would say, is the sort of most widely received poet in the international scene. Sepehri is not, unfortunately, is remaining one of the more unknown poets. In the recent years, there have been a couple of monographs coming out about his eco-poetics, but mostly from sort of a comparative point of view. It was a book by Dr. Bahar Dabari, if I'm not mistaken, about the theological eco-poetics of Sohrab Sepehri that was in comparison with James Baldwin's sort of, approach to the same concept. And there are translations of Sepehri. Thanks to Karimeh Emami, during his lifetime, he was translated into English, and he did receive some critical reception during that time. Dariush Ashuri translated him to French and wrote about him in French, but it really remains limited. If you mean rigorous academic work, unfortunately, beyond a few essays, we don't have much. And my hope is that, in the coming years, Sepehri could be a subject of inquiry for researchers, hopefully more than before. In terms of where to start, again, another good question. So much. Are you a Persian speaker or English speaker? I think that's an important question.
I believe the questioner was an English speaker.
Okay, so yes, in English, as I mentioned, unfortunately, we don't have much on him, but you can start perhaps by a couple of essays. Again, I don't necessarily agree with their premise. So there is an essay called Sohrab Sepehri as a neo-Sufik by Masoud Farzad, that tries to kind of situate Sepehri and contextualize Sepehri's poetry as part of the neo-Sufik trend of the modernist period. It's very limited, but it gives you some idea. Another book that I just mentioned was I tried to find the link and send it to but if you search Bahar Dabari and Sohrab Sepehri, I believe it's called Theological Eco-Poetics of Sepehri and James Baldwin or something like that. As far as I'm aware, that's the first monograph that actually critically deals with Sepehri as one of the major poets. There are other, passages here and there about his poetry in anthologies, but also translations of his poetry. There is a book called The Oasis of Now, I believe, by Kazem Ali and another poet. They translated a selection of Sepehri's work into English, including his two sequence poems that I didn't have much time to go into, Traveler and The Sound of Water's Footstep. So those are, those are some starting points, and hopefully in the coming years, I hope that people write more about him.
Thank you. I'm going to continue to combine questions since we're short on time. So the next set of questions, one member of the audience asked you to elaborate a little more on the relationship between Sepehri's poetry and paintings. And along the same vein of his impact on the connection between his poetic and visual narratives, someone would like for you to talk more about his influence on Iranian filmmakers like Abbas Kiarostami, who were very drawn to his poetry.
All very good questions. Again, you can see that, based on the questions, you can see that there is a lot that to be said. There is a great article by Dr. Khatereh Sheybani, I just remember, about Kiarostami's cinema, and in particular his inspiration, sort of modern Persian poetry, particularly the poetry of Forough Farrokhzad and SOHRAB SEPEHRI, as his sources of inspiration. So I highly recommend that article. I think it gives you a great sort of insight into, how Sepehri's poetry relates to Kiarostami's cinema. But if I want to say just a couple of words about that, I think if one thing that is very obvious in Kiarostami's cinema and his revolutionizing role in that is to basically reformulate the notion of image or picture, right? And also the space and the relationship of the human with the tree, for example, and the horizon. These are important concepts in Kiarostami's cinema, and these are all embedded in Sepehri's poetry and also his painting. So that's sort of the multidimensional quality of Sepehri's poetry that I think has a lot to do with his sort of image-oriented mind that comes from his from his artistic background as a painting. One other thing that I didn't have time, of course. I tried to incorporate his painting into the presentation, but it didn't work. But he has different phases. Dr. Balaghi knows better than I do, but and perhaps if you have a word to say about that, he has different phases in his artistic genre, oeuvre as a painter as well. Like his poetry, he starts with sort of geometrical shapes mostly, and also drawing and sketches of rural settings. In his hometown Kashan is one of the most important sort of points of return for him in his early work. And then later on, especially during his traveling in the 1960s to Japan, his painting and the colors, particularly the blue that he uses, kind of is completely transforming his work. And if you look at the modernist Japanese painting, you can actually see a lot of parallels and similarities. And the kind of blue that he uses, of course, is very, very specific, and I think also resonates with the whole Eastern spirituality, including Persian mysticism as well. And then later on in his life, and perhaps the most important highlight of his artistic oeuvre as a painter is the trees series, which is really important also. And as far as this notion of liminality that we discussed today is concerned, he brings this very sort of deeply rhizomatic view of life. Trees become basically and uprooted trees as well, trees that become a metaphor or an extension of the human being that is uncertain, that is, as we read in his memoir in Japan, is kind of near here nor there and sort of suspended. And that notion of suspension and in transition we also saw in his poetry of this period.
Thank you. And following up on that, we have several comments and questions. Wanting you to talk a little bit more about Sepehri's views on religion, tradition, mysticism, and the sacred, and how those ideas can sometimes be misunderstood. If you could talk a little, elaborate more on that.
Sure. There was a quote that I didn't have time to share with you, part of his autobiography, actually. And he says, you know, when I was a kid, I used to pray. I followed my, the sort of the elderly, my parents, those who were around me. They prayed, and I would follow, and I would also pray. And then later on, I realized that, I prayed for a long time without having a God. So that's just sort of a paraphrase of what he says in his autobiography. You can read it. It's online if you read Persian and, parts of it. By the way, this talk was based on sort of a part of it was based on a paper essay that I've written, and it's under publication. It will come out in English. Singing on the Threshold. It's about, the liminal poetics of Sohrab Sepehri. For those of you who are interested, it will come out in Iran Namag. And there I, go into all of these questions and delve into all of these questions, including the question of religion. So one thing in general, I was saying this to Dr. Balaghi and to Mr. Ardekani, before the beginning of the session, in general, to understand Sepehri's views and aesthetics, I think you can't just read his poetry and then, kind of conclude what he was, or you can't just look at his painting and come to a conclusion. You have to read his autobiography. We are lucky to have that. We don't have that for a lot of poets. His sister, Paridokht Sepehri, has done a lot. I think that is really admiring in that regard. So his memoir are important, his painting and his poetry. All together, we have a sense that we are dealing with a poet who is deeply curious and open and sort of absorbs a lot. So, and looks and observes. His final collection, which I didn't have time to go into, Ma Hich Ma Negah, basically he goes back to his very, very early stages where looking for him becomes important. Observing becomes much more important than writing. He even says it, that I don't read many books. I try to look and observe. And this is basically the painter Sepehri that we see. In religion as well, he is absorbing, he is observing, and he's synthesizing. He's one of the best synthesizers of our time when it comes to religion. He gets everything and beautifully and masterfully combines them: Taoism, mysticism, Buddhism. And what we have at the end really is a synthesis that is very unique to Sepehri himself. We don't see that in any other modernist Persian poet. Even among these, other modernist counterparts, Eliot, Ginsberg, the way in which he does it, which is, not easy to understand, of course. I think the act of transgression becomes extremely also important. He constantly transgress, goes beyond the rigid boundaries of religion and ideology in order to create a new kind of religion, if you like.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time you took to answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And we got a lot more questions, and we'll be sure to share them with Dr. Shams so she can review them all herself directly at a later time. I have to thank Dr. Shams for today's fantastic lecture and conversation about one of Iran's most influential figures. And special thanks to Dr. Balaghi for joining us for today to moderate today's talk. And as always, we're grateful to Dr. Janet Alfari and the entire team at UC Santa Barbara for organizing this annual series in collaboration with Farhang Foundation. As always, please visit farhang.org for all our latest upcoming events, talks, and programs. We thank you all for joining us from across the globe for today's talk, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. Thank you once again to Fatemeh Jan and Shiva Jan for taking the time to join us this Saturday. And until then, we bid you all farewell. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.